So are we like on now? Is this
Yeah.
the thing? Okay. Oh God. All right. Well, here we are. If we still have anybody listening
Well,
and
it's not being
watching at this point.
streamed.
Well, I know that. So it's really interesting that this issue, both with learning loss that we've talked about ad nauseum in the past since 2020, when we released our learning loss handbook, and then bringing in this direct instruction and capital DI direct instruction, which is a completely different beast. Well, not completely, but it's kind of like, adjacent to lowercase direct instruction. So I thought it would be really useful just to situate it with this article from McGraw-Hill, which we can kind of tackle. We can read what
Really
this is
quick though,
about.
to add a
Yeah.
little bit more context, I do think
Okay.
it's fair to note that this is really out of left field for McGraw-Hill, even though
Okay.
McGraw-Hill is ostensibly a textbook company, and they kind of follow the money. McGraw-Hill, especially in the last like decade or so, has been very forward thinking on equity, DEIJ. I brought up this article here just as one example of many of the McGraw-Hill blog. And they have things on like anti-racist teaching. If I go here into McGraw-Hill's Medium page, wellness, perspectives on AI, classroom norms. Here's that random direct instruction article, project-based learning, teacher leaders, connected classrooms. The general vibe of McGraw-Hill posts tend to be what I would see as the more progressive side of education as opposed to this idea of direct instruction.
Interesting. Okay, so that is context that I did not have, but it does come up a little bit in the first paragraph of this. Is this what classrooms look like or what they want them to be? I don't know. But if you look at that, it says the first sentence, we are all weary of conversations about learning loss. And it's from a piece from the Hetchinger report. I don't know. I've never pronounced it out loud, but I've read several things on this website. From December 2022, students are still hurting and
Right.
need counseling, safe buildings, and further interventions. And in that piece, the authors of that piece call it so-called learning loss. The piece from McGraw-Hill is going to double down on what they are saying in the introduction is a distorted and incomplete story.
I mean, the
So,
first
yeah,
paragraph here from McGraw Hill is typical corporate speak. It
yes,
opens up by saying, hey, learning loss, that's not really a thing, or at least we need to be hesitant about it. And here's all the information that supports the fact that learning loss probably not a real thing. Here's an article that we should keep in mind about how learning loss probably isn't a real thing. But at the exact same time, hey, we got to close those gaps. So here's an entire article about how we need to close achievement gaps
yep.
and how learning loss actually is a real thing.
We know all that stuff was bad, but we're going to go ahead and double down on this thing anyway. They're going to grapple with the realities of learning loss, is what they say, even though may or
Yeah.
may not be real, nation's report card, etc.
There's no denying that there is an achievement gap. Like that's a real thing that exists. But the way at which the achievement gap is addressed through testing and other means makes that gap
Right.
worse.
This is almost exclusively, right, a pedagogy, an approach reserved for what they label, right, as low income or disadvantaged or
Right.
urban or
I
whatever. And
mean,
these are all
this
code
picture
words.
looks like
Yes.
a champion promotion image.
Here is the thesis of, I think, this video. Okay. There is untangling the data and the narrative around learning loss, which is what we're just about to get into with this section here. And then there's the reality and application of uppercase direct instruction, DI, which is right there on your screen, which is this scripted, programmed approach to instruction. But here's the deal. I think that the modern conceptions of this direct instruction, the film we're going to watch from 1966 from the dude who invented DI, is so much different from what DI looks like in those videos that we watched last week. Because here's the implication. The implication that there's a big dial, right? And teachers have access to this dial, and they've just kept the dial down low. Okay. And all we need to do is crank the learning dial to accelerate learning by 4.1 months and to catch up from compounded losses, right? This is economics speak applied to education because this is one of the ways, right? This is how
Edunomics. Oh
the lab,
gosh.
the Edunomics lab, the study of education
Yeah.
finance. So here is their calculator, calculating investments to remedy learning loss. They say, okay, students in LA Unified lost an average of 22 weeks of learning in math a number of weeks in reading. Okay, now it's okay. 7 weeks of
It
learning in
didn't even
math.
do that
2 weeks
bad. You only lost 2 weeks of learning and reading.
Hey, okay, that's oh my
That's
god.
only gonna
The
cost you $1.1 million.
yeah. So here is one way that planners, elected officials, and of course, economists are thinking about learning, which, in my experience as a teacher on the ground, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Whoa, okay.
This
Estimate
is,
the impact of lost learning time for students in your district. What in the world is that equation?
you have to
I
do
don't even know.
astrophysics.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I maybe I didn't take very high level math courses, but I don't even know what this symbol is right here. What is that?
Yeah,
Just
from
take
trying
that
to read.
equation and then just simply
Yeah.
look at the numbers. Come on,
Yes.
dummy.
People who were considering themselves and their families at risk of COVID wanted these options. And now, right, their kids are turning around and they're saying, "Oh my gosh, these kids are so far behind because of the decisions that you made."
It
Of
is worth noting the priorities too of folks that do this type of research, where the first thing they list is $2 trillion in lost wages and not
Yikes.
lower life expectancy.
And let's say too that I think the interesting part here is that think of the money wrapped up in the people who are pushing this narrative, because schools closed. Well, now we got to switch to this scripted curriculum.
This is obviously something that I wrote. Just going through the data itself, because it's fascinating when you look at the learning loss reports and what folks are claiming about the amount of learning loss that's happened over time, that the way these numbers are come to is absurd. Using the NWEA's own data, which I'm looking at the 2021 data, we can
Right.
make a prediction of how much learning was lost. And these numbers that they choose on lost learning in this report are entirely subjective. So the way that they came to these numbers is they said that students were learning at typical rates until March 2020, followed by roughly 52% of learning through remote instruction, which that's, if you look down here, assumed growth for high quality instruction. So the best you can learn in remote instruction would be 52% of high quality teaching. Test scores dropped when we look at the RIT scale, which is this here on the left. This is a RIT number, which if you're taking an adaptive test, which is how they're calculating this, like your nation report card score, your
Mhm.
map testing, things like that. The way the test works is it keeps giving you harder and harder questions until you start missing a few. And then if you miss a certain amount in a row, it kind of settles you at the score you should be at averages. You get a few right, you get a few wrong, and that's the score that you get. That's your adaptive score. Well, the amount that it's predicted to drop and the amount that it actually did drop in most cases is by 0 to 5 points. It's really not that big of a drop. You can see here where we went from 230 to 225 roughly if we look at this chart here that they're predicting,
Right.
which is actually what happened in most cases, or even like 230 to 220.
It doesn't seem it doesn't seem like it's actually that bad. And what's really funny is when you even if you look at the NAEP scores, the nation's report card scores from the last 2 years. So of course this came out, when we were before we had the more recent scores, the it, there's not like there's a drop, and of course they will make hay with this, but it's not actually like lower than it was, Chris, when you and I were in school. We're, I think, functional, happy adults. We're married. We own homes. We can function in society, and we tested at a rate that our cohort tested at an average that would be about equivalent to what kids are today. So I don't necessarily see the sky falling on that. And of course, it depends on what you look at.
Wait, what was that disclaimer? Let me make sure that I'm not gonna, like, get thrown in prison here for looking at this data. Did you see that thing that said
No,
something about prison pop up for a half second? I guess we'll find out
no,
later,
you're not
whatever
getting the
that
full
whatever that
chart.
said. Okay, this is what I was looking for.
And again, a 5-point decline means what? Like, Is that one question? Is it two questions? What concepts are we missing here? That doesn't seem like such a big deal relative to the scale of the disruption that they're talking about, right? If they're saying
Right.
learning loss, school closures, again, 1.1 million dead Americans, 200,000 kids dealing with caregiver loss. This is a testament, to what schools did during remote learning, school closures, etc.
And how much money happened right here too? From
That's it.
'03 to 2019,
That's
how
it.
much money did testing companies, testing reform places, tutoring companies, direct instruction companies, how much
Right.
money was invested into schools to increase this number ever so slightly? So let's now turn it back over to the direct instruction piece because
Yes.
now we understand what exactly it is that we're addressing these losses. So Nick, how is direct instruction going to save us?
Yes. Okay. So again, I want you to have in your mind that map that we saw of those flat scores, those
Yep.
flat fourth
Which
grade
direct
scores
instruction's
from.
been a thing that whole time. Schools have been using
Yes.
direct instruction for a very long period of time.
It's
Yeah.
exactly it, right? And of course, part of those top-down reforms from No Child Left Behind and even like Race to the Top was part of that What Works clearinghouse as far as hey, these are the random control trials of effective interventions that we know are tested, proven, guaranteed to raise math and reading scores. So those are things like capital DI direct instruction. And they say on here is a teaching methodology that's proven to close gaps and accelerate learning. It's precise, efficient, and effective to ensure students gain mastery of foundational skills when implemented with fidelity. And so, what is this? So, really, this is a scripted curriculum. And look how they talk about this. In direct instruction, skills are introduced gradually, reinforced, and continually assessed so that no student can fall behind. Content is delivered via scripted and quickly paced lessons while teachers correct errors. It's scalable, it's proven, blah, blah, blah. Here, I think, is the really interesting part. And I'll have you, we're going to go to Nifty here in a minute. Um,
Okay.
don't go to Nifty yet. We'll go to Nifty
Okay.
because they say
Alright.
it's based on two assumptions. All students can learn when taught correctly, regardless of history and background, and all teachers can be successful given effective materials and presentation techniques. It's been said that DI programs, quote, cut the fluff and teach the stuff. What is the fluff and what is the stuff? Now, let's go
Is the
ahead and go.
anti-racism stuff fluff? All the things
Yeah,
that
right?
McGraw-Hill was talking about? Like, if I go through this list here, social media, transforming your educational practice, artificial intelligence, multilingual learning, um Sci science of reading goals, that's already a little sus right there. Project-based
Project-based learning in middle
learning,
schools.
classroom norms and agreements. I don't know, when I go through this, if I'm viewing this through the lens of a direct instruction person, a lot of these concepts seem like fluff. Project-based learning is not direct instruction. I would consider that to be fluff if I was coming at it
Social and emotional learning.
from that perspective.
Improving school culture.
SEL.
Let's go to the basic philosophy tab that you have on there because this is from there it is. This is from the National Institute for Direct Instruction. And again, not direct instruction like you just teach somebody
Great
to
web
do something,
design.
okay? Yeah,
I
but
love their
this
logo.
is
Is
this
this
is
their actual
capital
logo?
DI. Yes. And I kind of
Their
like
logo is
their
just a medal,
I love
like a
their
gold
it's
star?
nifty. I
There's an
love
irony
that.
there.
Direct instruction, capital DI, is a thing that was actually invented. It is a specific program that was invented by this guy, Siegfried Engelmann, or he's called Zig. Okay, and his other partner here as well, but Zig was the big face of it. He died in 2019. Their vision of DI is from these five key philosophical principles, right? And they say all children can be taught. Okay, now that is really interesting. They don't say all children can learn. It says all children can be taught. And there's a very specific reason for this that we'll see with Zig here in just a second. But if you scroll down,
Yeah, I think it's worth bringing up just the fact that it says only 10% of each lesson is new material. The remaining 90% of each lesson's content is review and application of skills students have already learned but need practice with in order to matter. And that just seems completely misaligned with how direct instruction is being pitched for addressing learning loss. Because if you're only getting to 10% of each lesson as new material, you wouldn't get through the baseline curriculum, let alone all of that lost learning that was existing over those multiple months, right?
what's really interesting is these are always pitched as techniques that are either used for, kids from low income, kids from urban areas, black and brown kids, kids with learning disabilities, all these kinds of things get this really prescribed way of learning. Now, let's go to the video because this was a film that let's actually watch this. You can clip it however you want to, Chris, but this is fascinating both in how he describes it and the work that
It is
actually he does with
28
kids.
minutes long.
I know, we'll just watch a portion of it just to see what it is, but let's
Okay,
listen to
all
him in
right.
his own words describe it.
Yeah. Definitely gonna need the subtitles for this one on because the audio is rough.
In this film, you'll see the end product of some of our efforts. You will see children sitting down and showing off what they could do in arithmetic. That's what it is, showing off. No attempt to teach, just to show what they've learned over, for some of them, a 2-year period, and for others, only a 1 school-year period.
It says that's not very many hours when we can set their lessons lasted 20 minutes a day. So what you're seeing in this is only direct instruction for 20 minutes a day. That is something that I don't find that egregious, right? Yeah, teach my kid how to read, how to do math in this scripted way for 20 minutes, and then they can take the other 7.5 hours and do, the other stuff. All right. That doesn't sound like cut the fluff and teach the stuff. It's when you start to apply this approach to every single hour of the day is where things start to get really hazy for me.
It's a non-systemic lens to a direct instruction problem in school because
Right.
it makes things a lot easier if you're doing direct instruction if it's only for a very short period during the day. I don't think anyone would really push back that heavily on that. It's when you make it 7 hours a day and destroy all love of learning of kids and make them miserable that this doesn't work.
Why is it the case that, black and brown kids, kids with disabilities, kids from low income backgrounds, from underfunded communities and underfunded schools get 8 hours a day of crap that looks like teach like a champion instead of some other things here? So the other thing I'll point
Yeah,
out
and
before,
conversely, why is it that
yeah,
rich kids get to do project-based learning?
what's interesting, when we watch this clip, I want you to think about what we saw in the Teach Like a Champion and how kids really didn't have a lot of freedom to, right? They had to respond in scripted ways, they had to control their bodies, they couldn't shout out or speak out, they had to interact. This is not what we see at all in this. I think this is fascinating because I love what I'm seeing on this.
Plus 2 equals 10. Say it. What's 10 plus 2? 12. 12 plus 2? Good. Here's our one. 7 plus 2. 7 plus 2 equals 9. 7 plus 3? 7 plus 4? 7 plus 5? Okay, that's pretty good, but pretty easy. Wait till you see this one. Are you ready? What if I had something like a 6 plus 2. Yay! 6 plus, how many equals 6?
6 plus 0 equals 0.
Sure, so what can I do? Erase that B and... Good. What if I had something as hard as this? 7 plus R equals... Oh, sheesh, goodbye.
4.
That's it! Yo! 7 plus how many equal 11?
7 plus 4 equals 11.
Yeah, how'd you work that out? You got 7, you want to get to 11. 8?
8, 9, 10, 11.
That's incredible, right? Like, I would love it if my kid was involved in this group here doing this kind of thing, but that's not the application of DI as we see it put in practice today, right? There's none of that spontaneity, kids getting up out of their seats, kids fidgeted in their seats, kids shouting out, kids going up on the board and erasing all of those things, right? That's not what we see in those scripted, right, moment to moment actions as DI, capital DI, is applied as this big, serious, behaviorist program in schools.
This is just a very fundamental foundational practice in teaching. If you were teaching a basic concept to kids, you would typically open with 15 to 20 minutes of you covering that topic, and then you turn them loose to go do the topic. But as you just said, that's not how direct instruction looks in practice, because what they want is 45 minutes bell to bell, teach everyone like this constantly, and just keep repeating the information over and over, and the kids will enjoy it. I don't think it's as prescribed as the DI folks tend to pitch it as. He's kind of adjusting things on the fly and being fun about it and just writing up random problems. I
Right.
consider to be prescribed curriculum what they're saying, which is you read off a script and then the kids do a worksheet, which is not what's going on.
you and I, as progressive, self-described progressive educators, can imagine a school day where you have 20 minutes of direct instruction that looks like this, right? About new content, fundamental content, foundational skills, all that kind of stuff. Fine. We can say, yeah, 20 minutes of direct instruction, a day that looks like that seems fine to me, right? As part of, as part of a balanced breakfast, so to say, he talks about where I think the big philosophical difference is.
And we developed sort of a theory, not of learning, but of instruction, which is pretty much different from a theory of learning. With learning, you're talking about what goes on in the organism and how it occurs. When you talk about teaching, you have your independent variable, which is whatever you're presenting to the kids, sensory data of some kind, and your outcome is their behavior. That's the dependent variable. So those are what you have to work with, and that's what you have to deal with. You don't have to go into the brain, into the mind, into other things. These all exist, but they're perfectly irrelevant to the problem of how do you get this kid to learn X.
There's nuance here, right? I think
Right.
there's that 80-20 principle idea, which is a little theoretically questionable at points. But if we just take that as a concept, 80% of a typical
Right.
school day addresses more traditional direct instruction style content, I would say, at a typical school.
Yeah.
Kids working through Google Documents, doing PowerPoints, some self-directed stuff where they're doing a web quest or whatever you want to call them nowadays. And the 20% that's more hands-on, that's group-based, tends to be the elective. It's music class or whatever. What progressive educators would typically argue would be the other way around. 20% of the time would be reserved for more direct instruction, fundamental skills, etc. Then 80% of the time is for the hands-on, interesting, project-based stuff. The folks that are surrounding this movement to shift towards direct instruction aren't doing so just because they think kids are suffering from learning loss. The fluff are all of the pro-social programs that are happening in schools. Things like
Right.
anti-racism, social justice work, even community work is now being seen as some form of, I guess, like socialist Marxist propaganda. SEL is considered to be fluff, social emotional health. So at a time where kids are disengaged from learning, at a time where you have racism and sexism rising amongst youth, especially in online communities, at a time where mental health is at one of its worst points in teenage history, for when we started collecting data on adolescent health and well-being. That's the point at which direct instruction proponents are saying we should cut all those fluff programs and just focus on academics, despite the fact that school is a lot longer than 20 minutes per subject area.
It's just that we have to recognize that those framings tend to be overly simplistic and reductive. Okay, because nothing about what happens in public schools in particular can be viewed as absent all of the other things that schools do. Okay, policy, learning, science, schools, organization, all of those things. And it's really intended to create gaps where really none exist.
Right. And it's worth noting too that when we say science of something, I think you can be opposed to the idea of science of reading if it's being framed in the way at which they're describing science. In the exact same
Right.
way that folks that sponsor this type of direct instruction, that the scripted curriculum instruction, there is research out there that supports these programs because they increase test scores. But there's also a hell of a lot of research that supports that direct instruction programs like this decrease engagement and student well-being.
Dutch researcher, of course, I'm a huge fanboy, but Hert Biesta would say, right, to suggest that research about what works can replace normative professional judgment is not only to make an unwarranted leap from is to ought, it's also to deny educational practitioners the right not to act according to evidence about what works if they judge that such a line of action would be educationally undesirable. To bring some other research to bear on this, one of our board members is a guy named Dr. Yang Zhao. And he has done a lot of research on this as well. In fact, he wrote this book called Why What Works May Hurt. and in which he challenges this notion of like prescribed interventions, which sounds a lot like medicine, doesn't it? So right, like you go see the doctor, they prescribe an intervention, the patient follows it and they get better. Okay. That's what this random control trial, intervention model of education is based on. And well, both Bista and Zhao would argue, well, that's not the correct way to view education because it's imagine if being a doctor was just about medical practice instead of patient wellness.
This is what my man Zig here was saying in the video, right? It's not about what's going on in the brain. It's about meeting the instructional needs of kids, which involves getting to know them. He says that they changed up their instruction methods to meet the needs of learners that were different. You need to meet the needs of the learners in the room, which involves getting to know them and teaching in that fashion.
So selfishly, this is a piece that I wrote, and so that's why I know a little bit about it. But Zhao actually studied these things, and here are some of the analyses that he includes in his work about kind of pushing back against these direct instruction approaches. Okay, so like for example, kids who were taught a function of a toy performed fewer kinds of actions with the toy and discovered fewer of its other functions than kids who didn't get a demonstration of it. So it demonstrated that direct instruction can be effective in promoting rapid and efficient learning, but can negatively impact creativity if instruction limits the range of hypotheses kids consider. So that's a relatively recent study. Same here involving play. Toys and groups of kids found children who were given instructions and directed how to play were less likely to explore and come up with novel solutions, and were more likely to imitate the instructor. Which again, fine for some things, maybe doesn't work for other things. But there's at least enough there to say, like, okay, maybe prescribing the DI approach for all things at all times isn't quite the right solution because we can see the ways in which it actually squashes conceptual understanding, creative thinking, right? And all of the other kinds of values that there are in education that aren't just about moving from point A to point B in the most efficient way possible.
Seems like McGraw-Hill has recognized that there's more and more money to be made through addressing learning loss, which all of the testing companies, textbook companies have capitalized on this idea of learning loss. I mean, the studies themselves are funded by, in many cases, the testing companies themselves. So it's a self-fulfilling feedback loop because if I can demonstrate that test scores are
These
going
direct
down, I can
instruction
offer the
programs are
intervention.
you buying?
Right.
Right?
Right. You're inventing the problem in order to solve it. It's interesting to me because McGraw-Hill is a multi-million dollar massive company. So they're playing both sides of the game. They are talking about DEIJ and about social justice work in order to appease, I suppose, those followers. And they're also appealing to the more direct instruction learning loss folks to appeal to those followers. And they're not necessarily in opposition to each other, but certainly the science of reading people are very different than the social justice oriented people in most cases, I would say. I wrote this article and I just wanted to bring up one little segment of it about neoliberal education. I don't think McGraw-Hill has any orientation on either of these things. Like when you look through McGraw-Hill's articles here, they don't care whether or not they're supporting self-determination theory or civic empathy or unhealthy school cultures or whatever it might be. They're just following wherever the money is. And I wrote this article about Jean Baudrillard because his whole thing was that forms of critique and resistance are only signs of resistance. Capitalist organizations like McGraw-Hill will claim that they are for something or against something in order to make people think that they're on their side, only to just simply capitalize on that bias or that perspective.
I think all of that is really transparent in the fact that these companies really haven't taken hard stances against book bannings and other, reactionary policies that we've seen targeting schools, particularly as they relate to, anti-LGBTQ or the anti-critical race theory, all of these anti-equity kind of motions. These companies have really either been silent or complicit in a lot of that. And so it's really one of those things where when Moms for Liberty talks about a science of reading, we need to get these kids reading. Well, then you ask, well, what are they reading? What can we have them read? And then we say, oh, we need to teach them to read, but not those things, not that book, not about these ideas, right? Then that's where those things become not liberatory, but actually, right, they're serving to perpetuate, the biases and prejudices that a certain subset of people want to maintain within the society. So
This is especially worrisome that McGraw-Hill would take this position at the exact same time that Florida is banning so many different forms of everything, culturally responsive
yeah,
pedagogy, social justice education, anti-racism, you name it.
cut the fluff, teach the stuff. Well, who writes the script, right? Who, what materials are they including in that script?
Is the purpose of education for kids to go get 8 hours of facts every single day as determined by a curriculum company? Or is the purpose of school to do more than that? And I think most folks in HRP circles or progressive educators think that there is something really special about a place where kids are going roughly 8 hours a day in a public space for free and interacting with people that are different than them. And there's a cultural piece there where you're developing empathy and caring about people around you and giving back to your community. There's a purpose of school there that goes beyond just learning facts. There's a connectedness component that you can find through concepts like project-based learning or through social emotional health programs and even learning explicitly about social justice. That shouldn't be a scary thing for folks. We're quite literally building a better world where people love and care for each other. It shouldn't be something that's deemed as radical.
Yeah. So come check out our stuff if you want to learn about how to do everything else. And I guess you can check out Zig and the Nifty Institute or whatever if you want to.
Cut that part really quick. Can you just really quick do the 10, 20-second?
What should they comment on?
What's their favorite like fluff piece? I don't know how you would describe this, but like I don't want to say what's your favorite fluff. That sounds weird.
What's your favorite fluff? Hey, thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And check out our website. We've got a donation drive going on right now, and you can find all of our other materials on our website. Let's restore humanity together.